Hey, Andy.
Hey Jed, how are you?
I'm doing great. Um, well, thanks for sharing this idea of creating WonkyFolk.
Absolutely.
It's something you and I have been batting around here for, I don't know, several months here. And just this idea that if there's anything that I crave in the education space right now, it's just some sense of coherence. There's just so many things that are happening at such a pace. And there's just so much variety at a national level. And certainly, one thing I've just valued in you, Andy, is your work at Bellwether is just being able to bring coherence, also with a perspective that's just nationwide. And so, hey, maybe we end up talking amongst ourselves, and we think that there's some value that we're adding for folks. But I just appreciate you willing to take a try with it.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. I mean, look, I think we both, I mean, everybody can agree, like the world needs, more middle-aged guys with podcasts. Like there's obviously a huge market gap there. And so I think we're gonna try to fill it. No, you're one of those people when I get on a call with you about something, like you end up having these conversations about like what's going on in the sector, what's going on in general, before you get to whatever the point of the call is. And you're always like, that conversation, like that might make an interesting podcast. So it's good to actually potentially try that out. Although unfortunately, I bet it'll be more stilted when we do it now than when you're just like getting on a Zoom to kick something around.
Well, we'll hope that we keep it fresh, and who knows, we may also invite some people down the road to broaden out the discussion.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. I'm looking forward to that.
cool. Well, and I also just feel like this nexus of, look, I overweight on charters in all sorts of ways, right? And I think that's a good place for us to be generally. But your knowledge on the wonk side, on the policy side, K-12, that's where I think if we really can focus our energy here, I think there actually is value for two middle-aged white guys to offer here.
Yeah, definitely. I thought you were just gonna say like coming out of the winter, I'm always a little overweight, just period. I thought you were gonna go there right out of the gate. Um, Yeah, no, I think that's right. And charters are a big part, and I think they're illustrative of a lot of what's going on. But like there are bigger things in the sector, and obviously this week, like a big one that's on everybody's mind, is just this horrific shooting last week in
Yeah.
Nashville at the Covenant School.
Yeah, I think these shootings have become so frequent that you start a podcast like this, it's almost off the news cycle already, and we're just grown so immune to it. But there are things that come up about this particular shooting that I just find just again illustrative of the problems that we face. And I mean, here it is. It's a private school, right? And the community that was involved or that was affected, all different and new. The political responses that we're seeing from policymakers, new, but all sadly, not very to the point. But I just think that these instances, these incidents of tragedy like this, I just think they contribute to a lack of trust that so many parents have in the public education system, or in public private education, wherever you want to focus at this point. And while I think like your last blog entry talks about the relative safety of kids in schools versus all these other settings, but the broader narrative is kids may not be safe at school. And if there's anything that parents, gravitate to, it's that desire to keep their kids safe. And so I see this potentially contributing to parents even pulling their kids back even more and trying to find other settings within to educate their kids where they feel like they're safe.
Yeah, but I mean, as we've seen over the last, couple of years, these can happen in any kind of a school. They happen at traditional public schools, they happen at charter schools, and they can happen at private schools. I mean, actually, they're really rare. Like I think we are sort of soaked. You have to hold sort of a couple of things in your head at the same time. One, just every one of these is awful and just unique in its awfulness, and that they're also pretty rare. I mean, I think most people are surprised when you ask, how many people have been killed in mass shootings at schools since, say, Columbine. You get some really astronomical numbers, and it's actually, fewer than 200, which is 200 too many, obviously. And again, everyone is uniquely horrible, but they're not as ubiquitous as you would know if you spend a lot of time, if you would think you spend a lot of time online. Meanwhile, like youth violence, particularly like out of school and communities, is an enormous problem, has been for a while. And to sort of to your point, things that don't get headlines, it doesn't necessarily get a whole lot of headlines, and it's just sort of a grinding and sort of staggering toll. And so I think we struggle to sort of talk about these things. And then when something like Nashville happens with some of the circumstances around it, everything kind of grinds to a halt. And what's I think really troubling about that is, you know, these shootings in general, not every one, but in general, they're preventable. 4 out of 5 school shooters say what they're going to do ahead of time. We don't have all the details on Nashville, but this person, their parents were, you know, apparently concerned enough about them to want to intervene around their access to firearms and so forth. And so I think what's getting lost in a lot of the rhetoric and the concern and the talk about hardening the target and all this is like, if 4 out of 5 young people who do something like this tell you that they're going to do it ahead of time, like why aren't we heading that off more upstream? To your point on trust, also what's going on with trust in the school with students where they can't engage adults around these things? There's so much leakage
Yeah.
ahead of time, and yet we're still not heading them off. And I think we need to have a hard conversation about school culture and why that is.
Well, yeah, I think there are a lot of forces at play right now that are keeping candor and agency out of schools, and so we have a lot of adults and a lot of kids that can't talk about the thing. And when you can't talk about the thing, well, of course you're not going to be able to talk about these kinds of things. But
Yeah.
my wife's a clinical psychologist. She was just forwarding me some stories from just social media about parents who are suing school districts right now over bullying and then suicides that have been happening associated with those. And I think these shootings, they tend to crowd out the attention on many of these other things. And so of course, I mean, the problem of gun violence in schools has to be taken on for sure. But also, these other issues can't be crowded out from our attention, such that we can like stay focused on what's really going on with our adolescent kids right now, because the psychological crisis that we have in this generation is unlike anything we've seen previously.
And they're related though, right? Like a few years ago, the Secret Service did analysis on school shootings, and one of the things they talked about was this leakage and this upstream kids basically saying in many cases explicitly what they were going to do, or having a lot of, in the case of Parkland, the shooter said explicitly what they were going to do when they got the chance, or lots of like signs and indications that common sense would tell you something's going on. But a common factor the Secret Service found was bullying, and that the people involved in these shootings, they were the victims of different kinds of bullying, and they actually called pretty explicitly for really vigorous anti-bullying programs, what you would call, SEL programs, stuff like that. And I thought it was interesting because, SEL is getting sort of sucked into this, ongoing culture war vortex we have. And here you've got the Secret Service, which I don't know that like anybody's going to describe the Secret Service like a hotbed of leftism. And they're calling for like, you have to do this, you have to create that culture. Because if kids don't have a trusting environment in school, they don't have adults they're going to trust, they're not going to go to them and say, hey, here are these things we're seeing that are worrisome, and they're not going to, you're just not going to have that kind of information flow. It comes back to, one of the reasons I know you got active in the charter world. One of the things that attracted me to charters is just where a place we can create a kind of intentional community where kids and adults
Yeah.
just interact in different ways than is sometimes the norm in schools.
I think kids are really tuned into whether or not there is authenticity and agency in their environment. And if they sense, for whatever reason, that the adults in that space can't say what they want to say, or it's all canned, or it's just completely and utterly predictable, they just disengage. And the only place the conversations will be happening is in the hallways or outside of school, or in social media, where, of course, a lot of these bullying problems get to be only worse. So,
Yeah,
for me, I just feel like the problem of lack of agency in our public schools is just much more profound than we recognize.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. So one of the things I know we wanted to talk about today, speaking of challenging public schools, is what's happening in a couple of the cities, and you're just down the road from Los Angeles, which was in the news quite a bit with that strike.
Yeah, I think that this strike situation in Los Angeles and the problems we see in so many urban schools doesn't get enough attention. And perhaps, my writing at Charterfolk just beats on it till people are just, ready to cry mercy. But I actually think no matter how much I can focus on it, there's still way more problems that are there than we're paying attention to. And we're seeing an aspect of, the urban education world only double down a path that we know is going to result in further demise. And that's certainly what I see coming out of the Los Angeles situation. I think things hang in the balance right now in Chicago. We are recording this on a Monday. The election results will be on Tuesday, and we'll release this on Wednesday. But Chicago and Los Angeles have probably been the two hotbeds of teacher unions taking on new levels of aggressiveness and new levels of political engagement. That's translated into them having virtual complete control of the Los Angeles Unified School District right now. And we'll see what happens, in Chicago. But should it go in the direction of the Chicago Teacher Union having more control in Chicago, I don't see that doing anything other than speeding the demise of the district. Do you see it differently here? What nuance can you offer as it relates to the challenges we have in urban education right now?
Oh man, I mean, it's hard to know where to start. And those two cities are, there's some commonality and some distinct issues. One of the commonalities is obviously just unsustainable fiscal structures. I'm sort of struck. We keep having these conversations and these entities. We've got to figure out what we do to get them on a sound financial footing, whether it's and it came up in the Chicago race, some of the issues around pension, retirement financing in LA. You look at, the school district's own numbers on the percent of money from the that they're paying into retirement for people who aren't even working in the system, the percentage of classroom dollars that are now going to that, it's staggering. And we're not sort of having any kind of an honest conversation about that. So whatever the latest thing is, the strike du jour and the sort of constant negotiation that the teachers unions have with the districts, it just plays out in these different ways. I was sort of struck that in the wake of the pandemic, all the avowed concern about learning loss and everybody saying they're going to get serious, that in LA you had this strike and there was just very little attention to, like, kids need to be in school right now more than anything else.
Yeah.
And we're just going to have another school holiday essentially for politics. And there was just like very little outrage, very little. It was just sort of almost seemed like it's business as usual, which was striking to me given the context and given the stakes right now.
Yeah, what was shocking to me was that, Jackie Goldberg was, and the superintendent was there saying, there's no need for a strike. We're willing to give you guys absolutely everything, essentially, and yet they wanted to strike anyway. And then at the end of the strike, when they talk about what the deal was, it was essentially the same as they had been talking about for weeks. So what really was the motivation here? And do we really have to have another 3 days of student, learning loss in order to make that point?
That's a tactic. And I think that's not always appreciated. Like the teachers unions, that having the strike, getting people out there, getting people riled up, it's a membership tactic. It reminds the members why they're there, all this stuff. And they will strike even when it's not, when you could actually get to a deal without a strike. We saw that in LA. That was really the sort of thing that really, I think, changed with teacher strikes in general. I think you have to go back to Karen Lewis and what she did in Chicago, back in 2012, I think it was, where, at that point, the unions were, Randy Weingarten was talking much more about reform than she talks about now. And, was saying tenure shouldn't be a job for life. And we need to reform teacher evaluation, a bunch of stuff that now would be, considered heretical. But she was going to the press club once a year to talk about all these things. And in Chicago, Karen Lewis was like, no, the hell with that. We're going to fight on this. We're not going to get on this train. We think there's another strategy we can fight. And essentially exactly what you're talking about. The ultimate deal was pretty much the contours of the deal that was on the table, but they were pretty explicit. They needed to be able to have a strike. It was politically important. And they did. And senior people in the union were relatively open about that was what was going on. And here we are. This keeps playing out. And the interesting thing about Chicago is it's such a stark choice. You've got Paul Vallis, and you can tell the director, we can talk about him and what he's done, and then Brandon Johnson, and it's two very different choices facing Chicago voters, and it can be no illusion about which way things will go depending how that race turns out tomorrow.
Yeah, the thing that I just think that we in the charter world in particular need to spend more time thinking about what is our agenda, what is our North Star as it relates to the evolution of these large urban school districts. I think for a long time we just basically stayed under the radar screen. Hey, that's not our job. We don't have to worry about what this thing evolves into. Let's just keep growing our schools and it'll work itself out on the other end. Well, now we're at that other end, and charter schools disproportionately have charged into large urban school districts to try and serve as many kids better than they've been served in the past. And now we've got just massive numbers of people leaving, major urban areas. And so our schools are there. They're fighting for enrollment, right? In Los Angeles, it's interesting. Basically, charter school enrollment has stayed flat for the last 5 years, around 110, 115,000 kids. But in terms of percentage of Los Angeles that is served by the charter school sector, it's grown from 16% to 21%, just because we've stayed flat. Okay, well, what is the future? What's really going to happen here? I don't think the charter school world can stay in a keep our head low mode anymore. No, we have to say, we actually think this is the future that all of public education needs to move into, and this is the role that we think charter schools can play in helping us get to that better place.
Yeah, and I think the charter community has a decision to make about sort of how it wants to play its politics, because one of the interesting things about Chicago is there's definitely a race element to the political race. There's a racial element to it, and you're seeing that, and civil rights leaders are talking about that. But you've got some young progressives in the city, some reformers who are African American coming down for Vallis, in part over the school issues and the reform issues. I mean, again, I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow at the ballot box. That's not a prediction. It's just you're seeing some of that, and I think that does portend there is this idea of how do you create sort of a multiracial reform politics that would include charter schools and used to include charter schools, and then you've got this countervailing pressure, which is the broader pressure in the country with the culture wars and everything, where the parties just cleaving apart, and charters feel like, well, we're going to go, their heart is with the Democrats, even though their political support is increasingly more with the Republicans, and you're seeing that tension. And that could play out in some really dangerous ways for charters, particularly if you decide these other issues that are sort of adjacent and tangential around educating kids become the thing that you're going to put front and center. So I think it's actually a pretty fraught time for charters.
I agree with you, and I think that the rationale behind the creation of Charter Folk was the idea that our charter people, believing that they're a part of something bigger than themselves and willing to do more than is typically expected, as has been our history, will continue to happen. Well, in our urban settings, when our charter folk are hearing all of these things about how we're on the wrong side of history and we're associated with all these whatever right-wing interests or whatever it is, our own base can become wobbly. Our own base can feel like we're on the wrong side of history. The only way, in my opinion, that we can communicate to them and to our other supporters and others that actually our values align with theirs is to come out and be more vocal about the way our school systems are set up, our redlining attendance boundaries, our selective admissions that we know screen out kids by race, our funding systems that suck money away from high needs kids to subsidize, more affluent families' educations, allowing schools to be completely and utterly unaccountable so that the kids that, are most vulnerable suffer most. These are things that are counter to our values. And the way that charter schools are set up, we are set up to operate schools in a completely different way. And we're going to advocate not only for our students to be served in that way, but all students to be served in that way. In that moment, I think, the progressives who have thus far heard silence from the charter school world will need to step back and say, wait a second, what do I think about these things?
I think so. I mean, you're an optimist. I think what's happening now that's very striking to me is two sort of related but somewhat discordant trends. One is among parents. You're seeing in the data, parents are more willing than ever to vote across party lines, move across party lines, coming out of the pandemic. They're frustrated. The old alignments don't make sense to them, and they want results for the kids. And so the parental vote is up for grabs. It's much more fluid right now. And then at the same time, among elites, you're seeing people are sort of chucking all their prior education commitments out the window in the interest of partisanship, because things are becoming so hardened. And so you've got Democrats who used to support charters who are now like, yeah, like that's too partisan an issue. They've gone quiet. And like those two trends, watching them play out, I think there's both an opportunity there for charters, but also just enormous political risk.
Yeah, and the disconnect between the public positioning and what the polling data shows. I mean, it was just striking in 2019. When UTLA had their last strike. I mean, every left-leaning person in Los Angeles, every Democratic policymaker wanted to virtue project. We are with the teachers. We're with UTLA. We support this strike, right? And then UTLA thinks, okay, let's capitalize upon that by getting this parcel tax approved that will fund, teachers being paid at higher levels. Didn't even come close to passing.
Right.
Not even close, right?
Well, yeah, it gives the lie to this whole idea of like standpoint epistemology, and that we're going to listen to people and do what they want. Because the support for charters, I mean, strong majorities support in the African American community, strong majority support in the Hispanic community. I mean, there's the idea that like charters are some sort of like unpopular thing or political jump ball. The only people who really aren't there on charters politically are white progressives, right? But white progressives and the teachers unions, that's a pretty powerful coalition inside the Democratic Party. And it's not an insignificant political coalition in general. And so sort of here we are. But I do think charters are one of those, they sort of, they pull back the, they pull back the veneer on some of this stuff. And you can sort of see where the more raw political power around some of these issues lies.
Let me ask you something on white progressives, Andy, because my sense is that their opposition to charters may be fragile. Because it can be shown that most of these white liberals have got themselves into very favorable public education situations that they now structurally deny others. But it's not being shown to them, or they're not being held accountable for the fact that they are reserving this special benefit for them. And if they were forced to encounter, to confront their own hypocrisy on this issue, I don't see how they stay in their current mindset unless they're willing to go to, okay, I actually oppose charters, not for these great progressive values, but for naked self-interest. I'm not sure that the white progressives can actually pivot to naked self-interest as their justification for charters opposition going forward.
I don't know. I mean, look, the history of ed reform in this country, going back decades, one way to look at it is it's a history of sort of people with means evading whatever sort of reform strategies put in place, whether it's busing or choice or anything else more recently, to figure out how to make the system work for them. I mean, I guess I do think there's something to, like, charters made a strategic error by focusing overwhelmingly. Obviously, the highest need is in urban communities and then rural communities, but focusing overwhelmingly on urban communities without having something there politically for the suburbs in a country where the politics are pretty suburban driven. And so but not building that coalition and so forth. I think they left an exposed flank that is causing a lot of trouble now. And so we should think about what does sort of a middle class chartering strategy look like. And I think look, people want customization. They want different kinds of schools. They want Montessori. And I think there's a lot of political opportunities to make sort of public school choice in the public system much more robust and attractive. But the second part of it is that is also, I think, in some ways self-inflicted. For your strategies, I understand what you just laid out to work. People have to be kind of willing to take some hits, be a little bit contentious, point out this hypocrisy and all the rest. And I think one of the things that really happened over the last decade, and you really have to give her credit for it, is Randi Weingarten kind of convinced a lot of reformers that they were the problem, that they were too acrimonious, they were too divisive, they weren't consensus oriented enough, and so forth. And that it was you heard like lots of the rhetoric that we have to collaborate and all this, and why do you have to be in, a lot of reformers started to be like, oh yeah, why are we so contentious, to the point where like Michelle Rhee would run a commercial pointing out that like a lot of our schools, like, huge achievement gaps. They don't stack up well internationally. And everybody's like, oh my God, that's so mean. Take down the ad. And funders got nervous about it.
Yeah.
Like, your strategy, if we do want to point out that, yeah, of course, like, everyone's kind of implicated. We redline education opportunity in this country by where you live. Our colleague Darrell Bradford's, I think, probably one of the most articulate people about this, but there's other folks. Tim DeRoche has a new organization. We do work on this at Bellwether.
It's interesting.
That, like, if you have to actually be willing to take some hits and point that out and be like a little bit contentious, not just for the sheer hell of, this isn't culture war stuff where it's just like for the sheer hell of spinning people up, but just, you have to be willing to say some controversial things and make people uncomfortable. And I just don't know if the appetite is there for that right now,
or if the courage is there. I mean, this is where my MFA playwriting comes back in. Aristotle knew all the way back, then, right? What's the making of drama? Conflict. You choose your conflict, and from that, you can drive a narrative. But
this
to
is
your
why
point
we get
about
along, Jed. When people come into the sector, they're like, they want to work in education. They're like, what should they read? And they're like, should I read like Dewey or E.D. Hirsch, or whatever? I'm like, start with Aristotle. Like, this is more. Understand the nature of power in politics, and like a lot of what goes on in this sector will make more sense to you.
But see, I ultimately think, our movement will be defined by what we advocate for. And I think that when we advocate for dumb things, that it's easy for somebody like Weingarten to say, you've been too extreme, you haven't been thoughtful, you don't have this all the way thought through, or you're just simply cheaply bashing people, without a real theory, we leave ourselves exposed. So I don't by any means say, oh, let's go out and just willy-nilly start like taking a meat axe to red lines. But I do believe that there are ways for us to like thoughtfully start to erase them.
Absolutely.
Such that the question is asked. We're not talking about huge numbers. We're just saying every school district in America should have to reserve 5% of its seats for people that come from outside the school district, so that we can start to have more choice, right? And see what people, how they start to respond at that point.
Yeah, little things on zoning. There's a lot of stuff you could do. I think choice is a piece of the solution set, but it's not the whole solution set. There's your idea. There's stuff you can do on zoning. There's a whole bunch of stuff. I actually think that's how it's as if, like, if you think about it, like if you walk from, you're in Los Angeles and I'm in Virginia, or, if you walk, you're in California, sorry, not in Los Angeles. We were just talking about LA, but you're in Northern California. And, I'm in Virginia. And if like we walk to each other and our compass is off, a little bit, we're not going to notice. You're not going to notice that when you're in Nevada, and I'm not going to notice that when I'm in West Virginia and Ohio. But when we're trying to get where we're going, we'll suddenly realize I won't get to your house. I'll end up in Portland or down in LA, right? And that's the way we have to think about how do you start to change the system. Some of this is like the Cass Sunstein ideas about nudge and so forth. How do you change the system so in 25 years people are like, oh wow, that's totally different, but they didn't see it. It wasn't. And you're right. I do think we have people who, and this is, I think, on both sides, who just want to be contentious. There's people who just want to sue school districts and all this, and lawsuits that aren't going to actually get anywhere given how the law works here. And there's, people just want to come in and try to blow things up. And it's conflict for conflict's sake is not productive, but there will be some friction if there's going to be, progress. That's a, pretty well established, principle as well.
For sure. Well, we talked about keeping this to around a half hour, so we're getting close. I wanted to just ask you one last question. What are you making about, and this could be another hour-long conversation, but just, let's spend a couple minutes ruminating on this. What are you making of ChatGPT and its implications for education? Is it being overhyped? Is it being underhyped? Is it are we in a moment where we just don't know? I'd just love to hear your thoughts about this, because my daughter just used ChatGPT to help her on her first, essay. It's interesting. She's writing about ALS, and ALS is at the origins of Charter Folk 2. My dear friend Brian Bennett, who passed away, and ALS really matters, in our family's life. And now Tess is writing me from college. ChatGPT has helped me understand ALS at whole other levels of understanding. But that's just one example. How are you thinking about it as it relates to K-12 stuff?
Yeah, I mean, look, Jed, I'm far from an expert on this, so I'm still learning. I listen to like people like John Bailey who are doing a lot of work on this. There's others, so I'm my sense is it overhyped or underhyped? Like, yes, both. Right? like I can see, I mean, every time there's a new technology around learning, people freak out. I mean, paper was controversial at one point. They tried to license printing presses. So when something like this comes along, everyone's like, oh my God, we've got to like ban it and restrict it and so forth. That's like a old human reaction to new knowledge technologies. I mean, even saw that a little bit with like in the early days of like email and the internet, there was some of that. And so like that sort of reaction is both understandable, time honored, and probably overstated. On the other hand, look, this will change teachers' jobs and so forth. I worry you're starting to hear already again, why are we teaching content and mere facts when kids are going to have ChatGPT, which I think is a huge misreading of how we learn and what you need to know to be able to understand the world and make sense of it. So like the excesses on all sides are sort of apparent. I think some of it's very exciting. And one thing I'm intrigued by, you look at some of the stuff it can do, and I screw around with it like everybody else does. Like everybody thought like automation and all this, they were like, oh man, sucks if you're a cashier or a truck driver. Turns out like probably if you write like entry-level ad copy, you work for one of these, websites that's basically a click farm and building listicles and this kind of stuff. Or maybe, and this is like hits close to home, maybe you're a blogger like me. This thing can do some of the things that you do. And that's, I think, interesting and maybe will occasion a slightly different and less sort of class-based conversation about automation and new technology and so forth. And my last thought is just the speed of it. I remember a few years ago, I was looking at some of this and messing around with it, and it was really bad, right? It just was not ready for prime time. And now, like in a relatively short period of time. So I don't know. And then of course, look, I've seen all the same movies you have, and so I worry, like, are they gonna, the robot's gonna kill us all, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's real.
So I have lots of thoughts, but no real answers. It's really interesting. What's your take? I mean, so obviously your daughter's now cheating in college. I appreciate it. What's your take?
So I think I patterned Charterfolk after Stratechery, or Stratechery by Ben Thompson.
Yeah.
And I've just been so impressed by him over the last 5 years of reading his stuff. And he's just always so smart, and he's always so measured. And then he had a chance to see ChatGPT, and he just went, just over the moon about what this meant. He had never had an experience interacting with technology in that way. And he wrote that, and that then led the New York Times and to BBC and all sorts of others quoting him and interviewing him. What is so new about this? I tend to think that since COVID and racial reckoning with George Floyd, this is probably the most important thing that has happened in the world. And when we look back on something that happened during this decade. And I also think it's happening at the same moment that trust in education is evaporating, and people want to be able to do different things, but they don't feel equipped to do it, themselves or in small groups or whatever. And I just think this ChatGPT thing is going to give people the confidence that they don't have to have any more trust in any other schools, than is absolutely necessary. And so if there's anything I think this is going to do, it's going to accelerate the forming of new educational models and ones that ultimately are going to challenge our public education system much more so than it will empower it.
All right. Well, I mean, that's a bold prediction. I'll be interested. We can revisit this. I'm not going to be in the prediction business, but by the time this does come out, and this will be our first one, we'll see what people think. We will know at least the answers to whether or not the Chicago cops can all put their "Let's Go Brandon" stickers back on their cars or not. So we will pick it up with that and some other stuff very soon.
See you in a couple weeks.
See ya.
Okay. See you.